Just a heads up, this is the second entry in a two-parter, the first of which is linked below, but if you don't feel like getting up to speed manually, here's a quick rundown. It recently struck me that several of the characters I play in fighting games give me a similar experience in-game, even though they share extremely little in terms of their mechanics. This inevitably led me to ask the question, are fighting game archetypes useful? Now, the question I'd really like to ask is if archetypes even exist, but it might be a bit radical even for me to disregard any grouping of fighting game characters under any metric. So instead, we'll stick to the question of usefulness. To begin with, let's lay out what I would say are some pretty uncontroversial baseline assumptions. 1. It is possible to group together certain distinct fighting game characters through comparison of their traits or special moves. And 2. These created groups, or archetypes, are a useful and quick way to evaluate what kind of character will suit your play. So let's dive into these one at a time. To begin with, let's look at the idea that you can, through looking at characters' available toolsets, codify them into distinct archetypes. So before we get into this in earnest, just a quick side note. Leon Massey brings up an idea in a project of his. In this video, largely about Guilty Gear Archetypes, he makes a statement about glass cannon characters in fighting games. I'd argue that this type of character doesn't really exist in fighting games, since the game type effectively nullifies their core characteristic. I mean, you can have a glass cannon, an extremely high damage but extremely low defense character in a team-based system, because they can then function as objectives or high-value targets. Fighting games are 1 versus 1 though, so all attention is already on the one opponent. A character doing massive damage but having extremely low health is almost entirely moot in these systems. Having high damage is debuffing your opponent's health, and having low health is buffing your opponent's damage. Fighting games tend to create these sort of low defense characters by giving them an otherwise too well-rounded toolkit. Not a glass cannon, but maybe more aptly described as a glass Swiss Army knife. So back to our toolkit breakdown. It's certainly an appealing thought that you could attempt to isolate your character's toolkit and then use that as a cheat sheet for finding characters that play the same way. Say you love the experience of playing Gran in Granblue Versus, shooting fireballs and anti-airing with your uppercut. Well, congratulations! You've hit upon an archetype that seemingly every single person on the planet both agrees exists and is pretty well defined. The Shoto. That sweet 3-hit combo of fireball, uppercut, and forward-moving special that has been ever so recurring in both 2D and occasionally 3D fighting games since the early 90s. But does this combination of tools necessarily tell you that much about the character you're picking? In the past, I've argued that Akuma in Street Fighter plays entirely different to his Tekken 7 iteration, but you might consider that a bit of a stretch. So let's take a quick comparative look at 2 quintessentially Shoto characters. Ryu and Ryu. Street Fighter 2 Ryu and Street Fighter 3 Ryu are, as seen through the lens of toolkits, nigh indistinguishable. They share an almost identical set of both normal and special moves. So if we're looking at them from a mechanical archetype perspective, we should be able to recommend playing Street Fighter 3 Ryu to a person who mains Street Fighter 2 Ryu. Right? Anyone who is familiar with these characters or their respective game systems, however, knows that both these iterations of the same toolkit offer quite disparate experiences. Street Fighter 2 Ryu relies heavily on mid-range space control with fireballs, locking down the opponent and baiting out mistimed jump attempts to anti-air with Shoryuken. He's a precision scalpel, if you will. Street Fighter 3 Ryu, on the other hand, is a chunky brawler. He likes to convert hits from the footsies game into big, aggressive plays. He stuns extremely quickly and does a grip of damage. At this point, you might get the urge to point out that Street Fighter 2 and Street Fighter 3 have vastly different game system, and that it's not a fair comparison. But are these games really more different than, say, Guilty Gear and King of Fighters? Examples like this seem to be the norm and not the exception when it comes to archetypes created from toolkits, which in turn seems to make the entire idea somewhat pointless. But hey, maybe we will have better luck approaching the entire concept by way of looser, less strict groupings. I mean, you could definitely argue that Ryu in Street Fighter 2 and Ryu in Street Fighter 3 still represent the same sort of vanilla, or dare I say, unflavored ice cream experience of their game's particular systems. That Ryu's archetype is not the Shoto, but the well-rounded protagonist. Seen through that lens, we seem to be able to jam these two Ryus into the same compartment, which neatly leads us into the second point. Do these archetypes help the beginner? To further clarify what kind of groupings I'm speaking about when I say looser, I suppose we should ask our collaborative creators. After all, they list archetypes like rushdown, poking, zoning, mix-up, and evasive. Actually, let's quickly stop at evasive. Arya in the TBS contribution mentions evasive characters as an archetype that focus on attacking through or slipping away from their opponent's offense by way of evasive attacks or stances. To begin with, I'd argue that this slippery nature isn't what lies at the heart of the experience that Arya is describing. It seems to me that the core idea of that notion would be their ability to overwhelm opponents who are too eager to go on the offensive. The fact that they achieve this by being evasive seems to me an afterthought, rather than anything to put front and center. I mean, lots of characters in different game systems have part of their gameplay identity tied to the idea of being hard to catch or even being able to evade attacks in highly unorthodox ways. Going by this idea that Arya speaks to, then Slayer in Guilty Gear could quite easily be described as an evasive character. But is Slayer a good fit for you if you enjoy playing Ling Xiaoyu in Tekken? I mean, do these characters represent the same sort of experience? This question made me think about a friend of mine called Goose. Or Goose? Is it Guys? And a conversation we had about Ling Xiaoyu and Art of Phoenix in the past. So I decided to give him a call and hear what he considered to be the essence of his experience playing the character over the years. Our conversation expanded and contracted into somewhat less clearly defined territories, but at the heart of what Guys was talking about lay his love of asymmetry. He spoke about how Ling's array of attacks and stances created an asymmetry of available options between him and his opponents that he greatly enjoyed.
Och sen jag kommer alltid tillbaka till just det här också att jag tycker om asymmetrin. Den är så kul liksom. Att Ling blir så kul för att det blir asymmetriskt. Om alla karaktärer hade haft AP eller någonting liknande, då hade inte Ling varit lika rolig.
When I later brought up characters he has played in different game systems over the years, he mentioned how this asymmetry was found in other characters as well, that were, on paper, very different to Ling. In Soul Calibur, for example, guys played Alpha Patroclus, who might seem to offer an entirely different gameplay experience as compared to Ling Xiaoyu. But he mentioned how Patroclus having access to extremely fast hit confirmable disrespect options and amazing character defining early punish options combined to create a similar feeling of asymmetry. And he stressed how he hadn't ever considered these characters inhabiting the same slot in any outlined archetypical breakdown.
Även om jag ser likhet mellan apat och ling i alltså 2A AP så är det ju inte som att de är samma karaktär.
Nej.
Och det var ju mycket annat som lockade mig till apat än det här. Och mycket var det ju, alltså att sitta med en metronom och pracka just frames, det var ju så här det var kul liksom, för att jag är dum i huvudet. Så att så här, det var ju inte någon appeal till Archetypes som gjorde att det passade bra liksom så, verkligen inte. Men för den skull så kan jag se likheter mellan karaktärerna, men det behöver ju absolut, det har ju inte med Archetype att göra.
All that being said, maybe someone would point out to me that these are archetypes within Tekken, and they're not supposed to cross over and fit the mold of other fighting game archetypes. At which point, I think it would be fair of me to ask, then who are these archetypes supposed to be useful for? If we assume that these archetypes are created to be context sensitive, i.e. being tied only to their respective game systems, then doesn't that make them pretty much impossible for beginners to use as a tool to gauge their interest in a character? If you have to know how the game system functions to get an idea of what the archetype represents, then doesn't that defeat the purpose of having one in the first place? So it seems we're stuck with trying to avoid this context sensitivity by still applying these looser definitions, but doing it in a fixed way. A problem that quickly becomes apparent is that we seem to then have to decide what game or games are to be our gold standard systems. Systems that we use to create these looser definitions. And even then, it seems to me that it is hard to apply, as Leon Massey rightly points out in his video about Guilty Gear archetypes. These Guilty Gear characters are all, in a wider fighting game context, going to at some point in a match be played as rushdown if one tries to apply this sort of archetypical framework on top of them. But I think that's a ludicrous idea, since that doesn't convey the actual experience much at all. Yes, pretty much all the characters in Guilty Gear are aggressive if compared to the rosters of lots of other games. But the experience I have playing Slayer versus Chip doesn't feel very aggro to me. It feels like I'm chasing a hare as a tortoise, only someone was nice enough to lend me a shotgun first. So where does this put us in the end? Are we supposed to just give up on the idea of recommending characters based on simplified descriptors? I don't know. Maybe? I get the feeling we could go a long way by just recommending people to communicate what kind of experience they are interested in and having actual conversations about the games or characters with people who actually play those games. But hey, maybe you disagree. Maybe I missed something. I mean, I probably missed something, right? Feel free to point out the thing I missed, and I'll catch you some other time.